So, on behalf of the organization I work for, the Union of Concerned Scientists, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to this board today on the very important issue of nuclear power plant siting in your community. We live in a very beautiful area, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person today to speak to you. The Union of Concerned Scientists is an organization that has served as a nuclear safety and security watchdog for more than 50 years. And we are neither pro nor anti-nuclear power. But we do believe that nuclear power has to meet very strong safety and security and environmental standards because it is technology that has the potential to cause catastrophic damage to human health and the environment if it's mismanaged. And we've seen examples of that around the world, most recently the Fukushima accident in Japan in 2011. So there's really no compromise when you're talking about nuclear power plant safety. I'm here today because I'm very concerned about the trends that we're seeing in the country and a push toward deploying nuclear power plants in ways and in places that are not consistent with the historical norms or operating experience. And because of that, I'm concerned that the industry today, in its zeal to try to demonstrate that it is relevant and can help to provide the power increase in power demand that's now being projected for data centers and other applications. I'm afraid that they're moving too fast, and especially with new and experimental technologies that in most cases have never had any operating experience. In some cases have operated on a very small scale, maybe several decades ago, but not to the extent that there's enough data and operating experience to justify deploying those plants in the way that they're being proposed. And so I think there's a very great concern here for a community like Eagle Mountain, who's potentially being asked to host experimental nuclear reactors in their communities that have not gone through the paces and the necessary research, development, and demonstration to make sure that they actually are going to be as safe as the vendors who are promoting them say they are. So I really think the community needs to do its due diligence when approaching this subject. In particular, if you open the door to allowing these experimental nuclear reactors to be within your city, that's essentially the only leverage you have at this point, to have your own local control over how that facility is built and operated. Because the Atomic Energy Act has a preemption clause, and that makes it impossible for local jurisdictions to block a nuclear power plant project on the basis of radiological safety. There are a few other levers that communities and states have, and they've been employed around the country. But local authorities cannot stop a nuclear power plant if they learn or they believe that it's going to be unsafe with regard to the potential for a radiological incident. That is an accident or a terrorist attack that could cause meltdown and a large release of radiation to the environment, as we saw with Chernobyl and Fukushima. So that preemption means that a statement I read online by Mr. Maffitt, who's the communications director for the city, who said, and I'll just quote this, it was December 11th, 2024. He said that any project we would put through a really rigorous review process. Nothing would go through that we feel would be unsafe for our residents and for the beautiful landscape. And I'm saying that statement is simply untrue, that the city would not have the authority, once you change the land use rules and other elements of control that you do have, then Washington and the federal government and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission take over. And at that point, the only recourse the citizens would have if they believe that project would be unsafe is to sue the NRC to block the project. And that there's not a very good track record, unfortunately, for trying to intervene against NRC projects. In fact, there's virtually always those interventions are decided in favor of the applicant. So for that reason, you're going to have to depend on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and how it does its business to protect the people of Eagle Mountain. And this is where I have concerns, because as a watchdog, and I'm here in the Beltway in Washington, D.C., monitoring the NRC very closely, I believe that at this point, the regulator is under so much political pressure from entities like the tech giants that have become interested in nuclear power to power their data centers. There's an enormous amount of pressure on the NRC to speed up approvals for nuclear reactors, to weaken the standards that have been employed over the decades to make sure that projects like those do meet very rigorous safety and security standards. And the combination of expedited approvals and weakening standards could be disastrous for a community like Eagle Mountain. It is an experiment, and I don't think you deserve to be subject to that experiment. And in particular, only recently, Congress passed a law called the Advance Act, and that directed the NRC essentially to become more efficient in everything it does. So the Advance Act directs the NRC to be more efficient, and it's being interpreted as a law that really should compel the agency to speed up new reactor approvals. And again, the problem is when you're talking about an experimental technology, there really is a process that has to be gone through to qualify that technology and to gain assurance that it actually will be as safe as it's being built. And unfortunately, the trend is at the NRC is to weaken the safety and security standards to license something like a small modular reactor to the extent that a lot of the safeguards that are present for the operating fleet would not be present for these small reactors. And that's a problem because a small reactor is not necessarily a safer reactor if you take away the layers of protection that are in place for those larger reactors. And I'll just give a few examples. The conventional nuclear reactor fleet are required to have containment structures. These are typically steel reinforced concrete domes that protect the reactor from external events like a plane crash, but also are there in place so that in the worst case, if an accident or an act of sabotage occurs that causes the highly radioactive fuel within a reactor to melt, you have the barrier, you have this leak-tight and pressure-resisting barrier to prevent the release of that radiation to the environment, or at least to greatly restrict. And for instance, in the case of the Fukushima accident in Japan 2011, where 3 reactors actually went through meltdowns, it was the containment structures that largely remained intact that prevented the release of most of the radiation within those reactors. But the NRC is on the verge of approving small modular reactors that do not have that same kind of containment structure, really any structure that would be strong enough to prevent the release of radiation in the case of a meltdown. And the rationale for that is because the vendors are arguing that the reactors are so safe, those containments simply aren't needed. And that's where I have a problem, because the information that's being provided to the commission doesn't meet the standards of scientific evidence to support that level of safety. It might over time, after these reactors, some of them are built and operated, more operating experience is gained, you learn more about the problems you might encounter in a new technology, then maybe you can start ratcheting down those requirements. But you don't do it at the beginning. And unfortunately, this overconfidence is that these reactors are going to be so safe because they look safe on paper. That is a threat to communities that may accept them without that level of evidence. And there are a whole other list of concerns I have. It's not just the containment, it's things like emergency planning zones. The conventional reactor fleet each reactor has a 10-mile emergency planning zone around it. That puts responsibilities on the owner of the plant to develop evacuation plans in the event that you do have a severe accident and a release of radiation. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has now provided a pathway for small modular reactors to have no offsite evacuation planning requirements at all. And that means that the owner of the plant would not have to spend a penny to develop plans for evacuating that area if the reactor had an accident. All that responsibility would fall on local authorities. In fact, that's one of the arguments that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission invoked when they approved that rule, is that state and local authorities are always going to be ready for an emergency anyway. So that's always going to be in place. And that's certainly true. But that puts the burden on you. That's an unfunded mandate and takes all the responsibility off the operator. So there's a whole host of other concerns like that, including security. The NRC is supposed to provide an option for having no security officers at all, no on-site armed responders to protect that plant from a sabotage attack. And I don't have to tell you that the threat of domestic terrorism remains high in the United States, domestic and internationally inspired terrorism, as we see, against critical infrastructure. And the notion that these plants could have no security officers at all to prevent that kind of attack is very alarming. And I think I'm running out of time here. So I've reviewed many of the types of reactor designs that are being considered for deployment for powering data centers and other applications, which I'd be happy to talk about. I published a report in 2021 where I looked at the safety and security claims being made for many of those reactors and found that they really are wanting because the evidence is just not there to justify how safe they are. So my lack of confidence in the NRC process is really something that I hope you'll consider and take seriously because, like I said, you're not going to have any recourse if you open the door to reactor projects without due consideration of what you're actually, the Pandora's box that you're opening as well. So I'll stop there and I appreciate your attention and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Lyman. Could you for a second time, I might have missed the organization that you are with. Could you state that for the working session?
Yes. It's the Union of Concerned Scientists. And we're headquarters is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and we also have Chicago and California offices. And it's an organization that's devoted to applying science-based evidence to public policy.
Thank you. Commissioners, Brandon, is just open. Do we want to have any questions from the commissioners for Dr. Any questions from our planning commission? Okay.
That's up to you.
Any questions?
Yeah, this is Commissioner Free. I just had a thought that came up is when we look at these, typical small nuclear modular reactors and the power that they use, there's different types of power, like thorium or different types. And can you address some of those and maybe, pros and cons of looking at some alternatives that way?
Yes, and there are many different concepts, many different designs, many different types of fuels. So when people talk about small modular reactors or microreactors in one breath, it really encompasses so many different designs and concepts. There's no one good way to characterize them. But there are some category which are modeled after the operating or conventional nuclear reactors, they're cooled by ordinary water and they have a uranium ceramic fuel that's low enriched uranium. And those are based on, again, there are innovations and there are significant differences, but they're still related to conventional technology. So they share some technology base. And NuScale, for example, which you may be familiar with, is one of those in that it's a pressurized water reactor. But again, the differences between that type of reactor and the large conventional pressurized water reactors are still significant and raise a lot of safety issues. Then there are more exotic types. For instance, you may have heard of the Kemmerer, Wyoming reactor called the Natrium that is being bankrolled largely by Bill Gates. That is a sodium-cooled reactor. So instead of using water to cool the fuel, they would use a liquid metal, in this case, liquid sodium. And although Bill Gates goes on television and talks about how great that is, in fact, there are serious safety issues with liquid metal-cooled reactors. First and foremost, that liquid sodium is a highly reactive material that can catch fire if it's exposed to air or water. So now you have to worry about a fire breaking out in your reactor core as well as everything else. And there are also other technical issues related to that type of reactor, which I think are potentially very serious instabilities that have to do with the way the fundamental nuclear properties of the reactor are. So, and there's much less experience with that type of reactor in the world. And a lot of the experience that has occurred has not been good. Those reactors are not reliable, for example. So then there are gas-cooled reactors. And X Energy is a company that's developing a high-temperature gas-cooled reactor. That's the type of reactor that Amazon is interested in pursuing. That brings its own set of challenges. There are some aspects of that kind of reactor which may improve safety compared to conventional reactors, but there are other aspects that may make it worse. And again, those reactors would not have, none of the reactors I'm talking about would have conventional containment structures. And then the final class of reactors are those that would use molten salt coolant, that is a material like conventional table salt, other types of those compounds heated to a very high temperature becomes molten and can be used to cool radioactive fuel or the fuel itself could be a molten salt, that is a liquid fuel running through the reactor. And those types of reactors, again, introduce unusual or different types of safety issues that have not really been studied to the extent that they need to be. And again, a lot of the claims that are being made is that you can essentially show the reactor safe on paper and you don't need to test a lot of the claims that you're making. And I just think that's wrong. And these typically would require different types of fuels than what the conventional reactors use. In particular, the natrium reactor and the X-energy reactor would require a more highly enriched form of uranium. And that means the uranium that's mined out of the ground has to go through a chemical process to enrich the concentration of the isotope uranium-235. Now, conventional plants only have to do that to about 3 to 5% uranium-235, but the natrium reactor would require going up to nearly 20%. And that's a problem because the higher that uranium enrichment gets, the more likely that material can be used, for instance, in a nuclear weapon. So there are serious terrorism and proliferation concerns associated with that type of reactor as well. And with a fuel like gas-cooled reactors, they use a fuel called TRISO, which the developers will tell you is incredibly robust. And it is true that TRISO fuel is designed to withstand much higher temperatures than conventional fuels because those types of reactors operate at those high temperatures. But it doesn't mean that they're invulnerable. And there are certainly ways in which those reactors could also experience severe accidents and release radiation. So there's no free lunch here. You have to do the work. You have to go through all the safety analyses, and you have to just appreciate what you know and what you don't know in order to be able to deploy them safely. And we're just not there yet.
Thank you. Other questions?
One quick question. I listen to the gloom and doom about this, but then on the other hand, I look at the nuclear reactors that are being used in our aircraft carriers and in our submarines, and they have been using those for years without incident that I'm aware of. What is different about those and compared to what you're talking about?
Yes, well, those reactors are entirely, at least in the U.S. Fleet, pressurized water reactors that is modeled after, that almost 2/3 of the fleet of operating commercial reactors are pressurized water reactors. These are of that type, except smaller. The argument, what concerns me there is that the military and the naval reactor fleet, which is originally that program was initiated by Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was well known to be extremely exacting and demanding in terms of safety. And money was not restricted when they were developing the naval reactor fleet. And so I think that the standards that are employed in the military, in the Navy, they don't have to suffer, they don't experience the same commercial pressures as an operating nuclear reactor would. And really, the nuclear safety is rooted in nuts and bolts. It's inspections, it's maintenance, it's replacing components when they need to be replaced instead of waiting until they fail. And that's I think where a lot of the differences lie. If the entire commercial fleet could be operated like the nuclear Navy, I think we'd probably be in a better place. But again, I think there are a lot of other factors intervening which make that unrealistic. And so, I think that's where some of the concerns are. Also, Admiral Rickover he made a choice, and this is well known, that there were two different naval reactor designs. One was for the Nautilus and the other was for the Seawolf. The Nautilus was the pressurized water reactor design cooled by ordinary water. The Seawolf was a liquid metal cooled fast reactor. And Rickover chose the pressurized water reactor because he determined that the other alternative was much less reliable and much harder to maintain. And it was probably that choice that contributed to the reliability of your fleet. But now, these liquid metal cooled fast reactors coming back, like the Wyoming. And again, I think if Admiral Rickover were around, he'd be shaking his head.
Thank you. Other questions? Commissioner Whiting.
Just one question. So, Dr. Lyman, you mentioned that the organization is neither for nor against nuclear power, but the one question I have is, if a small modular reactor were built, how far away from a city would it need to be in order for your organization to feel okay about it?
Well, that really depends on the design. And again, with the relaxation of the safety requirements that I'm talking about, I would feel less comfortable putting one of those reactors in the proximity of a densely populated area. And there's a long history to this. In the 1960s, the utility proposed building nuclear reactors in the heart of New York City. Those are called the Ravenswood. And in that case, the utility proposed having a double containment. So they were proposing more robust standards for that reactor. Even so, that didn't fly. There was a lot of public opposition. And the NRC ended up, it was the Atomic Energy Commission at that time, but they decided to come up with a policy that you shouldn't put a nuclear reactor near a densely populated area. And I still think that makes good sense because you simply can't, because you would need such a high degree of reliability and safety to preclude the potential for causing a lot of problems for a lot of people, that it would just be probably economically untenable. So I think, if you were going to add additional safeguards, an additional containment structure like that Ravenswood reactor, and, putting on more bells and whistles, more layers of protection, then that would make us more comfortable with having those reactors close to cities. But again, the trend is to go in the opposite direction. And so that's very troubling. Another thing you might want to think about is terrorism, which is something I've been greatly concerned about since well before 9/11. And the fact is that a nuclear reactor near a population center or near a data center makes it more attractive as a target for terrorists because they can get more bang for their buck by attacking that. So you also have to worry about whether there'd be unintended consequences or whether the presence of that reactor may make a community more attractive for a terrorist attack than others. So I also offer that.